What is up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to the heaviest show in the universe. Today, we are going to talk about the fucking heaviest band of all time, Pantera. And we're going to talk about how they influence modern metal and the new wave of American heavy metal coming out of the year 2000. Let's get into it. Alright, let's just start off in the 90s, because before the 90s, Pantera was an absolutely subpar, bottom tier glam metal band. Of course, in 1990, they released Cowboys From Hell, but before we get into that, let's talk about metalcore. Let's talk about the origins of metalcore, which really started in the 1990s. And I'm not yet talking about bands like Killswitch Engage or Shadows Fall, which would come out closer to the end of the 90s and the early 2000s, in that melodic metalcore kind of combined with melodeath sound that would really come out of the new wave of American heavy metal. I'm not yet talking about that kind of metalcore. No, I'm talking about Earth Crisis and Hatebreed. These very heavy bands that have this very punkish sound as well, with these like shouted, grungy vocals that go hard, that have tons of breakdowns. This is kind of the music that was in the underground. So we had death metal in the underground in the late 80s, but more and more bands started to become a bit more hardcore, with the influence of crossover and thrash kind of dying out. This new breed of music called metalcore was kind of laying dormant in the underground, and that would later become super important. If we want to look at the broader state of metal at the time, bro, it was kind of dying. Of course, you had Megadeth releasing Rust in Peace, the absolute GOAT greatest album of all time. But then you also had good albums like Metallica releasing the Black Album, which is a fantastic album in its own right. Don't hit me with this like, oh, the Black Album sucks. The Black Album is an objectively fantastic album, okay? It is a fantastic piece of music, and don't come at me with this, oh, they weren't thrash anymore. Dude, you gotta make money, okay? So they made good, anyway. Is a tangent. Don't get me started. And of course, you had Megadeth also releasing Countdown to Extinction in 1992. Anthrax, Persistent of Time, 1990. Death releasing Human around 1992. And of course, we had Seasons in the Abyss in 1990. And other than that, other than like Metallica and Megadeth, and you could say Slayer and Anthrax with the Clash of the Titans tour were big, but Metallica and Megadeth were really the only like big thrash metal bands that were still going on in the 1990s, because thrash, the popularity of it from the 1984 up until the 1990s, it kind of just died out, man. Like, the thrash thing was gone and done, like glam metal before it. People were still releasing thrash metal, but it wasn't popular. It wasn't as popular as it was back then. And the main cause for this was grunge music. Grunge music came in and it was kind of killing off thrash metal, and it definitely put the nail in the coffin for glam metal, thank freaking God. But it came along and it just changed the game for metal in general. And there were some heavier grunge bands, of course, like Alice in Chains, but for the most part, grunge was its own music. Grunge was making its own thing, and honestly, I really like grunge. I think it's great, but it's not metal. It's not metal, and that's the thing. Metalheads wanted metal. Metalheads wanted something heavy and fast and tough and groovy. Boom, we come back to Cowboys From Hell by Pantera, coming out full force in 1990 and smashing everyone in the face with this sound that they had no clue what to make of. And before you even hit me with this, oh, Exhorder has actually started the sound of groove metal, Pantera just copied it. It's like, dude, don't hit me with this Exhorder because they're underground. You're trying to be cool because they're underground. No one's ever heard of them, and you think they actually started the sound of groove metal. Okay, Pantera was really the band that brought groove metal to the fold and inspired all these later bands that we're going to talk about. Not Exhorder. They didn't work nearly as hard. They didn't release nearly as good music as Pantera. Alright? But dude, Cowboys From Hell changed the entire game. With this album, Pantera took the torch from Metallica and Megadeth, and they said, we are going to carry this music on for the rest of this decade. because Metallica and Megadeth, as it would show, would go on to create softer albums, more rock-oriented albums, more radio-friendly albums. And personally, I didn't really find anything wrong with that, but A lot of you guys don't like it. Well, thank God you have Pantera here to carry that torch, boom, into the new millennium. The sound that Pantera came out with on Cowboys From Hell was mind-blowing, mind-bending. No one had heard something like this so far. It was like thrash metal, but it was so heavy. It was like not death metal, but what do you even describe this as? It made you groove. It made you bob your head. It made you want to wreck shit. Groove metal. It would later be called groove metal. And I can't think of a better name for this type of balls to the walls, punch in the gut heaviness that would come out with Cowboys From Hell. And then they got even heavier with Vulgar Display of Power. It was crazy. How do you top Cowboys From Hell? You top it with Vulgar Display of Power, and no one would see this coming. These first two albums almost single-handedly saved metal and created the space for an underground scene to kind of bubble up, like the metalcore I was talking about before. Pantera in the mainstream, going #1 on the Billboard charts, selling out arenas. They're kind of keeping that space down below available for these metalcore bands, for these newer bands to take what they're doing and create more music, create better music in some certain cases. Because without Pantera releasing these Billboard topping albums, these fantastic albums, there's no energy, there's no passion in the metal scene. There's no one to look up to and say like, hey, we gotta be as good as them. We have to try to catch them, to make music like them, to top their music, to create something new on top of what they've done. And that's why Pantera was so important in 1990 and 1992. And of course, going forward, 1994 with Far Beyond Driven, 96 with The Great Southern Trendkill, and Reinventing the Steel at the turn of the millennia. Pantera was so consistently hard and heavy and in your face, but they were still adding new sounds, new types of additions to their music on every subsequent album, sometimes making it heavier, sometimes making it more melodic. Dime's playing would get a bit more frantic, a bit less contracted, and a bit more out in the ether. And so at the start of the new millennium, we had the new wave of American heavy metal really taking off. Bands like Lamb of God and Shadows Fall and Trivium, and of course Killswitch Engage and Slipknot. All of these bands were kicking off at the year 2000, 1999, year 2000, 2001. These bands were all starting to take off, releasing fantastic albums, releasing fantastic material. But you could all relate it back to Pantera. Now, of course, Metallica, Megadeth, Anthrax, some of the death metal bands, they're all influential to these sounds, especially with bands like Lamb of God, a lot of little intricacies in Slipknot, Killswitch Engage. Those bands can all pay tribute to the bands that I previously mentioned, but they can't pay tribute to them any more than they can pay tribute to Pantera for really laying the groundwork. Let's get a bit more into the music of Pantera and how it actually directly inspired these bands that I'm talking about: Slipknot, Lamb of God, Shadows Fall. And off the bat, I want to start with Vinny's drum playing. That slam that Vinny seemed to have on all of Pantera's albums really carried through and inspired these bands, Lamb of God, Slipknot, Shadows Fall, in particular with their drum playing, their drum style, the way the drums were produced, and the sound of the drum. Vinny's drum playing had such a unique sound, it was such a unique way of being produced, such a unique way of attacking his drum kit, that it was more like a slam click click as opposed to just the clickiness of thrash metal drumming in general. There was a lot more bass behind what he was playing. It was a lot more full. It was like this whole sound of Pantera was a lot more full, it was a lot more intense. And it started with Vinny's drum playing. And you can see his influence in bands like Lamb of God and Slipknot and Shadows Fall easily. Especially in a band like Slipknot, where I love to say that Slipknot just slams. They have this unique sound, this unique slam and heaviness that other bands do not have at all. And in my opinion, that influence comes directly from Pantera and Vinny's drum playing. And of course, the way Chris Adler plays in Lamb of God is directly a sound descended from Vinny's early drumming in Pantera. Another thing that really set Pantera apart from the thrash bands, a way that they took thrash metal and turned it into groove metal was by tuning their guitars a full step down. And along with the death metal bands of the late 80s, they were really some of the first metal musicians to take that guitar and tune it all the way down a full step. Doing this really brought the groove to Pantera's music. So Rex and Dime both tuning a full step down and going along with Vinny's drums, this was a mind-blowing sound that people hadn't heard yet. Dimebag, man. What an absolute legend who was taken way before his time. He was so inspirational. He was so unique. There's not many guitar players I could think of as more unique than Dimebag. He had such a wild, shocking, crazy lead sound, and he had such an amazing way of going up and down his guitar and creating blues riffs into metal riffs. One of the first times I realized how unique Dime was and how inspirational he was to that new wave of American heavy metal was that solo in Walk where he does the and walks up and down, like slides up and down the fretboard like he's a blues player. And to really get a handle on the influence that Dimebag truly had on this new wave of American heavy metal, we can look at a song like Reject Yourself by Killswitch Engage, which has an incredibly typical metalcore type riff. Take that and compare it to some of the rippers that Dime made on the underground in America. And I haven't even gotten to the pinch harmonic yet, which is an absolute staple in anything with the word core in it. Deathcore, metalcore. Before Dimebag, pinch harmonics were like a here and there type thing, but Dimebag took the pinch harmonic and made it a part of the music. It made it almost as essential to Pantera as the full down tuning of their guitar. Like, dude, honestly, try to imagine Killswitch Engage or Lamb of God without pinch harmonics. Dude, Dime was really the first to do pinch harmonics in such a large, consistent scale. All of these big bands of the new wave of American heavy metal and modern metal in general, Killswitch Engage, Shadows Fall, Slipknot, Lamb of God, Trivium, these guys were the children of Pantera. They stemmed from Pantera. Without Pantera, none of these bands come along. None of these bands have the groove and the slam and the power and the energy that Pantera did. Pantera's energy was unmatched. Their groove was insurmountable. And the way that they attacked music was something that would inspire metal for generations. Above all, when metal was being forced back into the underground by things like grunge and hip-hop really coming out in the 1990s, Pantera took the torch from bands like Slayer and Metallica, and they carried it through the 1990s with piss and vinegar and vigor and pride, and they really set the stage for this new wave of American heavy metal to come out. They were topping billboards, they were selling out arenas in a time when everyone just wanted to listen to Kurt Cobain whine and complain about his feelings. They really gave bands the space to take the groove and heaviness that they alone pioneered and mix it with the DIY style of that underground metalcore that I talked about at the start of the video with Earth Crisis and Hatebreed, and create that new wave of American heavy metal. Not only is Pantera one of the heaviest and greatest metal bands of all time, they're one of the most important for today's metal scene. And what they did in the 90s was nothing short of laying the foundation for all of the modern metal that you and I love and enjoy to this day. Thank you so much for tuning in, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed today's video on Pantera, one of my favorite bands of all time, one of the heaviest freaking bands of all time. I've created a Spotify playlist for this episode down below, which will show you really the mix of Pantera and these new wave of American heavy metal bands and how it all really came together. It's going to give you that feeling that I'm talking about in this video if you didn't already get it. Be sure to smash that like button for me, subscribe down below, and head on over to the Instagram page at The Heaviest Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the show, and we'll see you next week on The Heaviest Show in the entire freaking universe.